Today's scripture reading brings us to 1 Samuel chapter 26. 1 Samuel chapter 26. It has a lot of similarities to 1 Samuel chapter 24, just 2 chapters ago. And because of the similarities, there's a lot of people that think that chapter 24 and chapter 26 are kind of the same retelling of this, a retelling of the same story, but there is entirely too many different details for that to happen. The locations are different, the interactions are different, the way that, and when I say interactions, I'm talking about Saul and David's addressing one another, and then David addresses Abner in this one, whereas he doesn't in the first. The first interaction is in a cave. This is out in a tent. And so there's just too many differences there. This will be the final interaction that David has with Saul, though. This will be the final pursuit that Saul gives unto David before his death. So that being said, I have this chapter broken down into 3 sections. The first is verses 1 through 12. Saul pursues and David responds. The Ziphites come once again to Saul and tell Saul that David is down this way. Saul comes down and he pitches there in the hill of Hakliah, is how you say that in verse number 3, which is before Jeshimon. And David abode in the wilderness. David sends out spies, and he sees that Saul is very well with them, finds out where he's at, and then asks some men there, and he says, who's going to go with me? He's going to go down into the belly of the beast, down where by night, where Saul and his 3,000 men are sleeping. I mean, this is bold, and it's bold for a reason that we'll get to here in, let's just get into it now. If you were to look back at chapter 25, what you're going to see, if you recall, is that God intervenes on David's behalf on 2 fronts. David was getting ready to go make a mistake when he was charging down there to kill Nabal. God intervenes there. And then, after the interaction and Abigail stops David, that very next morning, Nabal has some type of stroke or heart attack or something, lays comatose for 10 days, and then leaves this earth. And you see David's just his praise of God, that God had pleaded his cause after that. So the effects of what happened in chapter 25 are really taking hold in David's heart. David is saying, the more God moves in your life, the more confidence you have in the Lord. This is what's happening to David, and this will certainly happen to you. The more that God moves in your life, the more faith that you place in the Lord, and you see God moving, the more faith it's easier to place in the Lord in the future. So David is brazenly going down into there. He takes the spear, he takes the cruse of water, and then he retreats up a ways. And then we see the next portion of Scripture is found in verses 13 through 20, and that's David chastises Abner. Abner was and then pleads with Saul. Abner was the captain of the guard, right? He's the head honcho that's in charge of Saul's army, and of course, your main duty is to take care of the king. Abner didn't do that. He fell asleep. Now, it was his duty either to do it himself or he had charge of someone to do it, but either way, he failed in his duty, and so David gives him down the road for that. And then we see, again in this interaction, David's humility, and I want to look at verse number 19 there. He says, this is David speaking unto Saul. He says, now therefore I pray thee, let my lord the king hear the words of his servant. If the Lord have stirred thee up against me, let him accept an offering. In other words, if God is moving on your heart to come and get me, he said, then let me make an offering unto the Lord. In other words, I'll accept that, and I will give whatever is necessary unto the sin in which I have committed. But then he says, but if they be the children of men, cursed be they before the Lord. In other words, but if it's men that's stirring you up against me, then God will curse them. He said, for they've driven me out this day from abiding in the inheritance of the Lord. So David chastises Abner. He pleads with Saul. In his plea, you see his humility. Calls himself a flea there again in verse number 20. And then lastly here in verses 21 through 25, I have that titled, David and Saul's Last Interaction. Saul again sees the error of his ways. And you see this, I thought it was interesting. Verse number 21, then said Saul, I have sinned. Return, my son David, for I will no more do thee harm, because my soul is precious in thine eyes these days. Behold, I have played the fool and have erred exceedingly. And David's like, thanks, but no thanks. He says, and David answered and said, behold the king's spear, let one of the young men come over and fetch it. David was not going to trust Saul at this point. Why? I mean, you look back at what happened in chapter 24, and he's been pursuing David for years. And in chapter 24, David could have killed him. And yet here he is coming again to seek after David's life. David wasn't going to trust him. Saul was not in his right mind. He was certainly not being led by the Spirit of God, but by another spirit. But Saul at least appears contrite. This is a moment of serenity for Saul. And he says to him in verse number 25, then Saul said to David, blessed be thou, my son David. Thou shalt both do great things and shalt still prevail. So David went his way and Saul returned to his place. Again, last interaction between David and Saul. I believe at this point in time that Saul's has another year or so left in his reign, and then he's going to leave this earth. And it won't be by the hand of David. David would be guiltless before the Lord in that respect, and that's good. So anyway, that's going to be 1 Samuel chapter 26. I hope this has been some sort of help to you. God bless, and we'll see you soon.